I want to thank you all for coming.
Well, thanks for having us.
Yeah. We dug deep and made some phone calls and got some people to come at the last minute, which is real nice. This is a special event. This is a special treat. I've been with this chapter since 1982, and I don't know much about the beginnings of the chapter except from reading the history that Linda wrote about. You all know, let me introduce Linda Largy, Ron Largy, and Gerry Davidson. These are our first two presidents, are Gerry and Linda. And if it weren't for them, someone would have picked up the ball at some point and started the New England chapter.
Don't count on it.
What?
Don't count on it.
Well,
Thank you.
No, they did it. I mean, anyway, so we're so thankful for them, and we gathered them here to talk about how it all began, and it really is quite the story. So we're going to start with Linda.
Okay.
Largy.
Thank you. Thank you, Phil, for inviting us to come up here today from Leominster to talk about the beginning days of the chapter. Ron and I started boating on Winnipesaukee back in 1966, and we're the owners of the Great Escape today, and we've always been fond of old wooden boats. And we had gone to a Boston boat show, and I'm going to say it was in 1972, when, about right, and there was a boat there by the name of Norma Jean. And it was a beauty. And so there was a lot of us gathered around looking at the antique boat. I think Jimmy Irwin was the one that got it to the show. And we just all hung around and talked and, made friends while we were there. And we decided to start a list. And so we put a list out and had everybody sign in their name. At the time, we didn't have email, so it was their name, their home address, and their phone number, so that later we could send out a notice to everybody to get together again and possibly form a chapter. At that time, the Antique and Classic Boat Society had just begun. So we were the first chapter in the ACBS Society, which is pretty exciting. And what I did from the show is I took that list and we did a U.S. mail out to everybody on that list. There was probably 28 names on that list. And we formed a meeting at a Howard Johnson's in Nashua, New Hampshire. And we all decided that, yes, we should become a charter to the ACBS. So we're founders of the New England chapter, and Ron and I are both charter members of the ACBS, so we've been around a long time, even though I was only 17 at the time. At that first meeting, again, I had all the papers and notes from the Boston Boat Show, and Gerry kind of took charge of running the meeting. And we had another lady there, you probably remember them, Pat and Minnie Young. Minnie Young was passing the hat around to pay for the postage that I spent in doing the mail out. So right away, Gerry became president, I became secretary, and Minnie became the treasurer. And I don't know who else was on the board at that time.
Vinny and Jim.
Vinny and Jim, they were like...
Explain who they were. They were like...
Oh, well, Vin Callahan owned Channel Marine, and Vinny and Jim Irwin owned the Irwin Marine down in Lakeport. So they were invaluable in the early formation of the chapter. As a matter of fact, they had a boat show before the chapter was born. And we had gone to that too. So right from the beginning, we jumped in both feet, and I became president after Gerry. 18 by then. I just want to talk about one of our favorite trips. You know, when we were a small group then, and sometimes the small trips are the best trips. There was a trip that Jerry, ourselves, Vinnie Callahan, his wife,
Bob Whitten.
Bob Whitman
Whitten from Maine.
from Maine. Who else? Jim Doherty from this area. We all decided to take Vinnie's steamboat up to Long Lake. And we launched at Long Lake, and we went down the Songo River, and that was exciting. We had a lockdown, and the little steamboat taking the whole trip. And then we stayed at a motel on a shoreline where we went inside, and we all were partying a little too much because some furniture got broken. So we had to go out for another steamboat ride and burn the chair. But those are the fun times. You know, we've had so many fun years with this, and like I said, I was so glad to hear from Phil to get us here together because we have a long history. And with that, can I turn it over to Jerry?
So that is the very good beginning of the whole thing. Now, it occurred to me that when they asked me to sit in on this, to think about what I wanted to say. And I've talked about what she was talking about several times. She wrote a couple of great articles. She was the one that held all the pieces together. I went flapping around the country, did this and that, spoke to them, wheeled and dealed with this one, met often with Jim and Vin for a few smiles. Code, that was a martini, smile. So he'd call and say, meet me down at the, what was the name of that place? His favorite restaurant was still there. It's called the 405 now. It's called the Galley at that time. So at any rate, I thought I'd characterize what was going on. What was it like in the 60s when there wasn't any club? And there was barely no club to even be talked about. And the two hotbeds were Lake George and Lake Winnipesaukee. They were a bit odds with themselves and with us. At Lake George, Ted was a well-heeled guy. He ran the last textile mill in Lowell, Wanalancet Textile Mill. He and his family had always had old boats, always had the property on Lake George, owned a whole point of land. It was a typical, scene of wealthy families. He was not your typical wealthy guy. Big belly, puffed on a cigar, suspenders. He thought as soon as you got a boat varnished, you should put on your lumbering boots and walk around on it. And that if that was a problem for you, you shouldn't be doing it. You shouldn't be in the business. And he was, I think I just found it. He was behind the scenes, but the reason it's important. Know him? Ted Larder. Early on, he was key guy behind everybody else. He was having a fight with Lake George. Lake George was of the opinion that it should be a national organization and everybody that belonged just to the national, and that if you acquired any wealth along the way, it was immediately transferred to the national. Pat Young, who you never heard of. Pat Young was a car collector, but he had a hell of a nice boat. Alaloo, too. Any of you know that boat? Until recently, it was called Alaloo. I don't know why he changed the name. It was owned by Chiang Kai-shek for whole bunch of years. So at any rate, he was actively involved, and he said, "Don't ever go to a national organization. They'll blow your brains apart with rules, and it's just awful the way they'll behave." So he was at war with Lake George and needed some allies. His thought was, damned if I'm going to belong to a blue blazer and white buck organization. If you haven't got some grease under your fingernails, you don't belong in this organization. That's what he would say. He said that to them out there. So they sort of ostracized him. But he became very active with us, told us what to do, what not to do in terms of organization. And he stayed with it, 10 years probably. But during that time, he ended up having to close down the business, which he sold to the federal government. It still exists, by the way. It's a park. He sold to the government, who made a park out of it, and they still run the mill down there. He had 6 boats he had since they were new, and that's the way he was. Now, let me just read some names you probably never heard of. Linda and Ron Larger, you have heard of. They're first on the list. She always made me look good. I just said a prayer every night. She just cleaned everything up, kept the records straight, because God knows I didn't. And Ted and Judy Latter, Jim Irwin, and Vin Callahan, Bruce Barnard, he's very sick right now, but Bruce was crotchety. Matter of fact, he and I were partners in Florida in a boat shop for 7 or 8 years back in the 90s. Dick McCann. And you guys ever hear that name? Dick McCann. He wrote the bylaws. He was a good bylaws guy. He wasn't good for much else, as I recall.
He was your vice president.
Yeah. It was a harmless job. He couldn't get in too much trouble. Nate Stiles was active. Pat and Minnie Young, they were hot shots, a lot of fun. Now, and a bunch of other people. Bob Lila, Roy Smith, he was the 3rd president, I think.
Yes.
And the Mitchells, Ray Everett, and the seniors. Perkins, Lee Perkins, who's here. Dick and Patty Hopgood, they've been here forever. Now, let me characterize what it was like. What did we have going that was special? Because it was special. Well, first of all, everybody wanted an antique club, and nobody had one. So, enthusiasm was rampant.
Why is that?
I could tell you. If you suggested something, the unwritten rule was, great, you can lead the effort to do it. Oh, you don't want to do that? Get it. So we had lots of people that were active, but the enthusiasm was the key. Until you can generate monumental enthusiasm at the per person level, this will not go that much. It'll go through the magnificent efforts of a bunch of you to work your heads off. But it won't really take off until everybody gets enthusiastic. Now, among all of you in the boating that I understand you do, the guy that would be generally accepted in that period, Tony Coco, he doesn't need a crowd. He doesn't need to show the boat. He just wants to jump in the damn thing and run. And he does it all the time, and everybody did back then. We didn't organize all kinds of meetings. We met. Somebody called at 9 o'clock and I said, hey, breakfast in the morning? Okay, we're going to Chase House. And we'll be there at 7. And that we met like that all the time. There were constant, unorganized groups getting together, all boating. Everybody boated all the time, as I recall it. So there were lots of impromptu gatherings, cruises. Somebody would say, "Hey, I'm going to go to Lake George. You want to go?" Now, a bylaw of Ted Lauder's was, got to be mobile. I don't know what else you do. Got to be mobile. If you're not ready to go somewhere at the drop of a hat, what are you good for? So he did. He went and dropped the boats in New York City, drove them all the way up to Lake Champlain. He went in the canal at Lake Champlain and went all the way to Canada and back. Did that kind of thing all the time. We cruised, we went to other places a lot, other towns. We went to Lake George. We went to Canada, to Muskoka, up in Bonnie Mason's country. We used to go there a lot. We used to go to hydro races, race boat races at Hollis, on the river at Hollis. And then we went to, and Ted organized that, to go to Moore Station on the Connecticut River in Littleton. And so, Lowell is where we went down there. And then we did winter meets, very enthusiastic winter meets. I did a valve job, Kermath, at one of those. We were there for one full day, and I had all the parts. It's in the book here. These books.
Bill Taylor wanted me to mention that.
Pardon?
Bill Taylor, our past president,
Is that right?
wanted me to mention that.
A lot of people got a kick out of that.
Valve job on it.
I had the parts done. The machining was done. Just had to put it together. But it's a big damn monster. And so here's the other thing that impacted it. There was no presence of professional restorers. There weren't any. The people that had old boats had typically had old boats all their life. Their families had them, their grandpa had them before, and so along we came, and not many of us were willing to get grease under our fingernails, but that's all there was then. And so I think that in a way, having professional restorers allowed us to get lazy. You just send it, if you had the bucks, you just send it off to somebody else. They did it, whether they did it right or not. And by the way, in the beginning, they seldom did it right. But the only ones that were really great restorers, Bill Morgan and Lake George, hackers. Now, Vinny and Jim would both varnish your boat for you. Pretty good job, too. Pretty darn good job. But it wasn't professional. It wasn't the kind of deal that you threw, $40,000, $50,000 at it to get a nice shine. And Ted didn't like that anyway. He built it, he did his own. But they were nevertheless very helpful. So, getting together loosely, whoever wanted to go, no big deal, no big planning, just get up and go. Usually enough planning would happen overnight. That's where you're going to leave from, what time. And the enthusiasm from that was rampant. Until you see everybody running around in boats, I'm not sure why would you get that enthusiastic of doing nothing but showing the boat? I mean, you can have bragging rights. It doesn't compare with breakfast run, does it? So you guys had done it. Okay, so that's kind of where, that was the condition it was in when we started. Now, as far as the war with Lake George, because we couldn't really go until that got sorted out. And so we went out, I remember a meeting out there at a Holiday Inn in Lake George Village, where everybody wound up in my room. About 25 people wound up in there. And there was a raging debate. You know, big discussion with Lake George, come back to my room. What does that mean? Blah, 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 blah. Back in,
Was Elaine there?
yes. Oh, yeah, my wife was there. She was very active in all this. And the result of that was we persuaded them that we would never go along with a national organization. We wanted it to be more intimate. We wanted to be closer together. And besides, we had more real boaters. They were beginning to get blue jackets, blue blazers out in Lake George. And we didn't want to do that. So it got, from that, it went to voting on forming it. Now the question was, there aren't any bylaws anywhere. No national ones, no chapter ones. Dick, how fast can you get the dry as words on the paper? You know, the rules. He did right away. Cut them, and they're basically what they are today. Some things have changed, but basically that's what they are. And we beat Lake George to it. So most of the terms we dictated. And it was all a function of who had them done. We did. And we were very active for 10 years, I'd say. When you went to do a show, the committees were a little different. We did a lot of work within the chapter. We always did the poster ourselves. We took photo shoots that we wanted to make a poster out of. Like we had Thayer 4 when they made the movie in '82. And we would seize something. I think Escape was on there more than once, probably. And we'd have a big picture made with a favorite printer in town who could work with us and would, on the cheap, do a good job too. I don't know if those pictures are still rattling around the museum or not. They were all up around.
Ted Hoplarder had one hanging in his outhouse at his Lake George.
Yeah, I've got a
I
picture.
walked into the outhouse and there's a boat in his.
The outhouse she's talking about was attached to his house. It was on the entryway to his house. It's not the main house, not the master's house. This is the help's house that Ted used. His mother used the main house. So in that hallway is a window. And Ted, one arm up at the window, taking a leak. And I snapped his picture. You know, and that picture got circulated around. Matter of fact, when he died and they had a gathering for him, I gave the picture to his son, Alan, because it was neat. A lot of good times. He would have now he was never he was a member, but he didn't hold office, he didn't do anything like that. But we stayed friends, and we used to go to his place a lot in Lake George.
Maybe you can, some of you out here know the beginnings that you're talking about, but some of us don't. In particular, maybe you could drill down on how the Wingate thing got started and who it was that had all those docks and how that all took place.
Okay.
We all went to that. You went to that. You won it once. I think you won it before we did. And the only reason, well, not the only reason, we did not win that one year because I only had half the screws in the hardware. I only had time. It was the middle of the night, you know. So I put every other one in. Everybody laughed about that for years. Wingate Cove is across the lake It's Tuftonboro? Is that where it is?
Right over here.
Yeah. And, yeah, just up there, yeah.
Jerry, it was Godfrey and Leo.
Yeah, I knew that. But that's not who owned it. So there was an old doctor that owned all the docks. Why, I don't know. But Godfrey and Leah Howard had a place right there on that property. And they arranged to do this. And they did the show. It was invitational. It was a very high top end if you could get invited to that show, let alone win something there. One prize per year. That was it. And it wasn't made to be, I'm better than you. It was made to recognize some boat that was interesting at that time. And they did it for 10 years. When it got to be the 10th year, we wondered what they were going to do the 11th year. When Godfrey said, enough, we've done this as far as we're going to.
Jerry, how did that relate to the chapter then? Did it overlap at all?
Probably.
Or was it-
They didn't pay the slightest attention. They had been running that before there was a chapter.
So did you keep running it after the chapter was formed?
They kept running it till they'd done it 10 years.
And then you went to the Weirs, right?
Pardon?
Then you went to the Weirs? No?
No.
No,
Always-
Godfrey and Leah Howard's show was after the formation of the chapter. We had been at the Weir show already.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Oh, so the two were overlapping.
they were, but they never paid any attention
No.
to what the Wiz show was doing. It was private. And it was a very, very nice occasion to go there. You know, it was a very laid back, no competition. Everybody talked. Anything else?
Yeah. I'll try to narrate this a little bit. In looking through, by the way, a couple of thank yous are in order. One is there's a lot of photos around, and I might say that Eric Soja contributed. There's 25.
We're here going that way all.
What do we call those? Photo albums or photo posters? Collages. There's 25 of them. And that is the very first show right there. And they go, if you go around clockwise, say counterclockwise, all the way to behind Ron is the last one, 25 years after it began. So it's pretty neat. The other thing is Mark Howard, who was hoping to be here, dropped off 2 albums, photo albums from the Wingate Cove years. And that's really interesting. You guys are in there front and center, all of you, as is a few of you guys out here. But many are missing.
All in Sue's boat is there. People's Choice is in.
What year was it?
75, 78.
What, these photos here? 73 to 78 or 9.
73 was the first year at Weir's Beach, correct?
Yes. The thing that stood out to me as I looked at those photos in those 2 albums was that it was really a major participation by everybody that was there, it seemed like. Families, kids. I mean, it was the whole ball of wax.
Are you talking about Wingate?
Yes. And maybe after Wingate too, but that's the only reference that I have to go by.
The early shows were all like that. We had more fun I worked on them a lot. There were a dozen of us that typically worked on shows. They were more fun than a barrel of monkeys. We did the poster, you know, we did getting those displayed. We talked about what we were going to do different, and no problem with a gang of people doing it. And we made it an occasion. We didn't hold any meetings. We took our boats and all went somewhere and used their dock and sat on their dock, and the Cammons over at Pendleton Beach, we used to go there quite a bit. And, but that's the way it was done. And so putting on the show wasn't a big chore. It was an occasion for all of us to put it on.
I'll go back to the time where, again, we were just starting out the boat chapter, and we were all in a meeting at Gerry Davidson's house, Nashua. And you had a basement family room. We were all down in the family room, and the chapter was just getting up and running, and we decided we needed a newsletter. And again, competing with the national organization, their newsletter was named The Rusty Rudder. What a horrible name for a newsletter. So we discussed it at quite length, and we came up with the word Cutwater. We're leading this group. And it was done by Dick Hopgood from the Monty Tech Regional Vocational School in Westminster, and he did the Cutwater for quite a number of years early in the beginning.
Well, we still continue to try to keep that going.
See this right here? This is Pat Young in my cellar at that meeting. He was a character. He was a lot of fun.
Hallelujah.
Hallelujah.
You guys still look good. Hardly tell the difference.
I was the kid.
Here's a run, you know, where you just, right away when the chapter took over the show, which was at 76. The next week we did a show the first show in Alton, Maine, was the next week. This is a group, we're on the way down with Hallelujah, my vote, and Dee Callahan. We like to run 10 feet apart. You know the rules, but we like to run. Because if you ever ran 10 feet apart and went at a good clip, to be a rooster tail between two boats, it would be this high, and we just like to run around the lake producing a rooster's tail 4 or 5 feet high. Well, the police didn't think I was such a big So they caught Vinny. They caught Vinny, and we didn't pay any attention. We kept running trucking just like nothing happened. And Vinny, and so Vinny finally showed up half an hour later. You know, we said, how'd it go, Vinny? He says, hey, got arrested. Simple.
When we were invited to join this group today, I wanted to try and locate all of the original documents that both Gerry and I had going way, way back. And we both discovered that we had given everything to Don Miner. And unfortunately, Don has passed away. And we tried to get in touch with his son, Sean, to go through the boathouse and see if we could recapture some of those old documents, because these were the original papers signed at the Boston Boat Show. And I'm sure we had the charter, the original charter. So that was all in the possession of Don Miner. So if anybody knows Don Miner's son, that might be an attempt for you to get in touch with them too. Unfortunately, he has COVID right now, so we couldn't meet with him this weekend.
Before I forget, one other thank you. Bill Irwin called. We'd called him to invite him to this event, and he was heading out to Portugal, but so he said he couldn't make it. But he said they were very thankful for being invited. His family had been very, very involved with this organization, and he regretted not being able to be here. But he wanted to give his family all the best to you guys, you two especially, and everybody else that was involved in that period of time. So I wanted to catch up with that. But one of the other things that I wanted to, while we have everybody here that knows something about all of this, is I want to drill down a little more on how the relationship, I guess, with how National got started and what the relationship was, and was that hard, and you know, did it take off like great things happening right away, or?
No, we weren't close with National.
Speaker.
It was quite the opposite. We were very anxious to do our own thing. And that was because of some of our members. This guy, Ted Larder, Bruce Barnard, Mark can attest to the fact that these guys, they were the people who had these boats all their lives and had wanted to do this for years. And they weren't going to be told what they could do and not do. So,
Out at Lake George, a lot of people have money, and their boats always came to our shows and won first place. And that was very difficult for the chapter because we were all self-restored boats. You know, we didn't have the money. It was just a labor of love to get those boats ready for the show.
some of our people thought you ought to do it yourself anyway.
How about this guy who spent 10 years,
Yep.
10 years working on the Escape?
One of the
That's
best
amazing.
woodworkers
Yeah.
that ever was.
We heard about the old mail boat that was going up for sale, and we came to the lake in '66, and that the Tonema had just lost its mail contract for delivering mail at the Wolfeboro Alton end of the lake. So we never saw it. So it was years later, someone approached us and they said, this was in 1975, did you know the old mail boat's going up for sale? And we both kind of said, well, I guess we're going to try and find this boat. And we did, and we drove around Alton Bay, and we found the building that could be the only building that could house this boat this big, 44 feet. And from there, we found out it was owned by Captain Lawrence Beck in Alton, and he was the mailboat captain for the Tonema for years and years that took passengers out on the lake during his mail run. So we inquired and we got to meet Captain Beck, and he again was a quite character on the lake, just like Ed LaValle at the other end of the lake. They were two competing postmasters. And so we met Captain Beck and we went down and looked at the boat. And it had been out of the water, how many years, Ron? 10 years it had been out of the water. And it was stored dry up in the air on a railroad track. And what Captain Beck did every year, thinking he was doing this good for the boat, was he would fill the bilge with water. And all that dead airspace in the fresh water completely rotted the boat out. All the ribs, all the transom, the frame, the whole boat was gone from the water line down. And we kind of took a deep breath and said we'd talk about it, and he and I talked about it, and he wanted that boat in the worst way, and we said, okay, we'll go talk to Captain Beck. And after having done a survey on the boat, we said to the captain, you know, Captain, unfortunately, that boat is gone. You know, it can't be saved. But so Captain Beck looked at us, he says, save my boat. And he practically gave it to us. I won't tell you what we had to pay for it, but he practically gave it to us. And he let us stay in that boathouse for almost 4 years as we restored the bottom to get it seaworthy, to drop in the water and bring it home to Leominster, Mass, so that we could continue the construction, putting it back into a private vessel. At the time we purchased it, it was a mailboat. The whole bottom of the boat was gutted out, and it had like pigeonholes for all sorting of the mail down below. And so we brought the boat home, and the boat sat there. And of course, we're both busy. I owned a real estate company. He was in construction. Never got to work on the boat. So it sat there for a good 4 years. And finally we said, we got to bring it back to the lake and put it in the water. And so that's journey. For years, we just worked on it piece by piece. The first couple years, we slept on army cots in the back cabin, which didn't exist, with no windows. And that's the way we did it. That's the way it was. We did all our work ourselves, like many of you, Charlie, everybody. We all do our own work. But the Great Escape was a project, and still an ongoing project. So.
I can tell you.
Ron and Linda for that.
When we think about guys that are handy with old boats, remember this is all happening in the 70s. I didn't know anybody at the time that could work with big boats. They were all down at the shore probably. They were in Maine or something like that. But one thing that sticks out of my mind and always has is that he had to replace the stem in it, or most of it, if not all of it. And he took dimensions off the old one, took the old one out. By the way, the trick to being superb at restoration is being able to take something apart perfectly. Absolutely perfect. It's hard to do that. I mean, anybody taking a stem out of it wants to beat the hell out of it and get it out of it. At any rate, he worked at least one winter, if not more. And then he was coming back to put the stem in the boat. And he gave me a call and said, "You gonna be around?" I said, "Oh yeah." He said, "Okay, I'm gonna bring a stem up, see if it fits or not." He brought the stem up and it was, like his height. And it was all massive oak wood, big stuff. He took that sucker in, stood it up where it belonged, put a little jack underneath it, and that thing fit perfect. And I never saw any work done any better than that. It was just perfect.
Good for you, Ron.
He had to buy a white oak tree. to cut the stem.
7.5 feet of the forward stem, and like they say, the only way you could get that kind of lumber was to buy a whole tree. When I went down to a lumber yard, they say, "What size lumber do you need?" He says, "Oh my God, you're looking for a tree." So I went down to Groseville, and they had just finished fulfilling an order for the Mayflower when they rebuilt that in Boston. So they had a couple of trees left over, and they were very glad to sell me one. But it was quite a project. So 7 feet of the forward part of the boat, and 13.5 feet of the rear stern was all replaced. So I replaced 35 floor timbers. So it's like the floor timbers of a house, and 60
The ribs.
60 ribs ends. I had to cut the old ones off about that long and put in new ones. And that was quite a trick. But I know today that I got a pretty solid product for something that almost 100 years old.
And they heated the house with all the wood shavings.
Another question relating to the old boats during your period of time. Looking through these photos, these were all big, beautiful boats. Now, I know you spiffed them up and spruced them up and all that sort of thing, but they had to be found somewhere. Were they always like that? I mean, wasn't there a period of time where people were taking them out and dumping them and burning them and you name it?
Instruments got junked on a scale we didn't want them to. Instruments. But
And you guys had the foresight and the what?
we'd grab them no matter how bad they were. But you're right. what you're not right about is almost all of them went into 3 years of hibernation to get to be a good-looking boat. I mean, a lot of work went into it.
Plus,
I'm
Jerry,
sure.
we had George Johnson, the unauthorized Coast
Yeah.
Taylor. He had a lot to do with bringing those boats everywhere.
Matching the boat up to who we thought ought to own it. We did a lot of that.
So there's a clutch of you all that had the desire to bring these things around. You knew that you couldn't lose these. This was going to be valuable, or at least a lot of fun somewhere along the line. So guys like Mark Mason and whoever.
Well, Dennis, when
And you.
when I got the hots for, the Goodhue and Hawkins, I took Mark and Jerry down to South Pole for a look at the boat. And Mark got on the deck, trounced around. I said, "You guys think I'm nuts?" And they said, "Absolutely." But it was, and then you talk about a stem. When it finally ended up with Paul Rollins, who did the bottom, he ran up to the attic of his barn. He came down with this monster piece of locust that was like this shape. And he said, "I've been waiting for the boat for this." And that became the new stem. But you're right, changing the stem is like, whoa, big time. And
Maybe this is a good time to kind of open it up to you guys out there, or maybe share a thought or two, or have a memory or a question, a comment.
I heard there was a thing in Wingate Cove, which is right down the shore from us. And I went over there, and they waved me in. And that's when I met Jerry, I met Ron, and that got me started, because Jerry was still, he had the flapper, and he was still screwing hatch hinges on. And Jerry had the Kermeth, I had the Scripps, and we were the only two people on the lake with big old motors. So anytime either one of us would be around, it was like. And then Pat Young got hold of Alaloo, and at one of the boat shows, one of the early boat shows, Pat, you probably remember this, Pat came running around and he said, "Anybody got any 50 weight?" I mean, who else are you gonna go to but Jerry or me? And so he kept that thing going until, I guess it either blew up or went to Bob Brooks or whatever, right?
Long story, but I'll tell you a little story. At one show, there was a big V8 engine that Chris Kraft built, called an A120. It looks like a flathead Ford on steroids. It was a big engine, and it was kind of crapped out. It had a serious problem. It had a piston seized in it. Pulled in at Pembroke Point down here by the Weirs, and hauled it in, put it down. Now, this is what we were up against back then. So what dealership were you going to take a 1928 A120 in and say, "Hey, can you fix up my engine?" Because you wouldn't have much luck. So Pat says, "Well, I don't have any tools. You got any?" He says, "What do you need?" He says, "Well, I need a ball peen hammer, and I need a big screwdriver." So at any rate, he takes off the cylinder head. That was had four valve covers on it. Takes off one set where the problem was. He goes in and takes a block of wood and drives down the piston, squirts in a bunch of Marvel mystery oil, turned it over with the starter, turned it over until it came back up again. Bam, 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 bam. Slammed it back down again, turned it over, boom. And once he could go reasonably easy, put the head back on, he said, "Okay, now where are we going to lunch?"
You asked who, in the beginning, who saved these boats. I think the guy who did the most for it was Bruce Barnard. I came up here in '76 from an ad in Hemmings to buy a boat from George Johnson. And George took me on, wasn't a real estate tour, it was the boat tour. And at the time, there was a mill on Lerner Street. It's still there, the big white building. They had the entire bottom of that, him and Bruce. Now, a lot of them might have been Bruce's boats, but they had the entire bottom of that full of 26, 28 footers. They had Bruce's yard full. There's a shutter mill up in Ossipee. I don't know if you know where that is. If you take Ledge Hill Road and you come into Ossipee, and there's a shortcut that, is that what it is? That building was full of boats. Where Donnie McLean lives, next door, there's a road that goes up in the back. But on the other side of the road, where the realtor, Chip Maxfield lives, there was a big barn there. I'm talking about 50 years ago. There was a barn there. That was full of boats. And these were all either Bruce Barnett's or George Johnson's. So they were giving them. I mean, at the time, people were, had them in the boatyards. The boatyards were burning them. And, they'd call it, they knew George, and it was Bruce to begin with. George came up here probably in '75. George's interest was because he was running a speedboat ride on the Connecticut River, and he needed boats. And he come up, met Bruce Barnard somewhere, and the two of them started saving them. So you ask who was behind it. It really was Bruce. Bruce was the first guy, and Bruce had the wherewithal to do it, and store them. But I can remember Ian. The Valpys at one point had a shop, I believe it was their shop, up in Center Harbor. And if you look, there's an old Time Life book on vintage boats, and there's a feature in there. Holderness, yeah. There's a feature in there of Valpy's shop, and in the backyard you could walk you could walk from one hull to another on the top of them. There were so many parked out in the lot. So when you ask who saved them, those were the guys who really were at the forefront of all of it. And Teddy Larder, I remember when he came here to one of the first boat shows I went to, he had Bull Venture, and I just thought that was the greatest boat in the world. I'd never seen anything like that. But those are the guys who really, did they know they were going to be valuable? I don't think that was the case. I think they just were interested in saving them, and they did, and that's who we owe it to. And I think Bruce was really the first guy, and Bruce could tell you almost every boatyard from here to Connecticut, what was in it and what boats were there, and that's what he did. I won't say he did for a living, because he never really did much for a living, but he's the guy who I think was at the forefront of saving the boats up here anyway. And then George, of course, started selling them off, and they went from here to Tahoe to wherever people wanted boats. But Bruce Barnard and George Johnson and the Valpys were, Bob Valpy, he's got all the hardware off the Legionnaire, or one of the big, he went down in New Jersey before they burned it, stripped all the hardware off it just to save it. I mean, those are the guys who were really at the forefront of all of it, and they weren't. I don't, like somebody said earlier, Vinnie Callahan and all them. They weren't big. They weren't officers of the club, but they were the nucleus of it. I think other people picked up the torch and organized it. But those were the guys who in the beginning saved the boats, and that's they started the movement here.
These were the organizers.
Well, that's what I just said. That's that's and that's got us to where we are today. But it's Bruce and George to an extent, and the Valpys, and they had fabulous boats.
Well, Nick, while you're on
Thanks, Nick.
Bruce did Jacqueline, which was a 26 triple that was in the Great Gatsby movie. And they shot for hours, and in the movie it's like 10 seconds. But that again blew everybody away, and it's like the early boat shows. The first one, Jerry, you remember, people were like paddling the darn boats in or swimming them over, and then Bill Morgan showed up with the 26 Hacker at last, totally done, and just whoa. That started to change everybody's vision of what this stuff could be.
So there was there's a progression of from the very early do-it-yourself kind of thing, and slowly Morgan and others like him showed you what this could
And I
be.
met Bob because I was going to go to school and I had to put bunco away. So I said, what should I do? Somebody said, go see Bob in Wilderness. So we took bunco and hoisted it up to the ceiling in the boathouse. What a job. And, but he had that 30, was it a 33 Mark? The big
Baby
Belle
dog.
Isle. There was a 33. He had that big Belle Isle, which is the one that's in that.
33 was the Garwood.
Oh. Well, the big,
a Belle Isle Bearcat
the Belle Isle was the one that's in the Time Life book with the Liberty engine in it. So that's the one in the Time Life book.
I often tell my grandchildren that no one does any amount of boating on this lake without having a story to tell. I have several thousand stories to tell because I've been boating here for 89 years, but I won't tell you all 1,000 tonight. But I have stories about Pat Young, and I have stories about Bob Valpy, and all of these names being mentioned tonight are wonderful memories. And I enjoyed meeting all of you too. And if you'd like to hear some of my stories, you can get me later.
Well, Lee, we're really glad you came because not many of us have had the opportunity to meet you, and you're a really nice gentleman. I'd like to have Mark. I'm sure Mark's got some early stories as well. He's a great orator.
I'll try to make it quick. I grew up in Michigan on a small lake, and my first speedboat was in 1964. I bought a 16-foot single cockpit racer, and from there it went on into other boats. In 1968, I became friends with a guy that was older. I was 17 at the time, and I became friends with Eldon Eby, who became my mentor, and he got me to concentrate to set a criteria of boats that I was going to look for, because every time I turned around there was another boat that needed to be saved. And so at any rate, I wound up coming east to the Clayton Boat Show in 1972, and that same summer I met the Lake George group, Ted Larder, and met Bruce Barnard from the East Coast, and they got me to come back and visit in the East Coast, and I wound up finding, and I knew Bob Valpy, and I wound up back in Michigan tracking down, because all the boats were built out in Michigan, many of them, and I wound up finding a great number of boats for Bruce Barnard and Bill Morgan and Bob Valpy, and I wound up moving east to bring Baby Bootlegger east. I restored it at Bruce Barnard's boatyard down in Cape Cod, and wound up living in the east, and love it here and have no regrets. So anyway.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Well, first of all, Jerry, congratulations and thanks for being here. It's great to hear all the stories. Jerry and I go back to the 70s when my wooden boat was berthed next to the Flapper, if any of you remember that boat. I love the name of that. Was it 26 Chris Craft, right? 26-foot Chris Craft. And Jerry and I were hunting for land for the museum back in the early 80s in Center Harbor. And it's interesting that the Center Harbor, the museum is returning to Center Harbor, and I was there this morning, and it's pretty exciting what's happening to that. And that's a vehicle that can help sustain this hobby that we all have, and this love and passion for American art and American manufacturing and these beautiful vessels that we enjoy. But I think on the comment of early on, it was we all worked on our own boats and we got dirty fingernails. That time has changed dramatically. And if you look around this room, there isn't a lot of young people in here, and that should be alarming to us. And this morning in meeting with the museum people, I have advocated that we put programs together to develop new generations coming in and having interest in working on these boats. And I have to give a great deal of thanks to Mark Mason. Mark, I don't know how long we go back, but it's a long time. And Mark, if you read about Mark, just go on the internet. It'll scare you how much this guy knows about and how much he's done to advocate this hobby and sport we have. So we owe a great deal of gratitude to Mark for memorializing things and bringing all of these things forward. But we need another generation of that coming along. And as I look around the room, all of us have been part of it. We love it. And I encourage everybody to think about bringing up the next generation. I've done my part. My son, Seth, who has come up. And I just wish he had 4 or more 5 guys here with him today to take on that next generation. And it probably will be a small combination of people that work on the boats themselves and a big portion of people that work on people's boats for them. Because if you're looking for the prior, you're going to have a very small hobby. But if you look at the latter, you do have people who are building one-off new boats, new replicas. When we first started doing this, boats were a dime a dozen. We're saving them from the burn pile. Those boats don't exist anymore. They've either been restored or they finally got burned. So now what do we do going forward? 1, to maintain them, and 2, what is the next generation? We couldn't, if the automobile industry stopped with the production of the Model A, we wouldn't have a very big automotive market today. So I think, I've talked too long, but I think it's important for all of us to think about how do we sustain, how do we take this to the next generation, how do we use maybe our museum to do that with this new 20,000 square feet of space, and have educational programs. Mark, good God, you should be a lecturer to a group of students, and all of you who have the skills of setting a STEM and how to do it, make sure that people see that, because there's young men and young women out there that when they see that being done, they're going to go, wow, that's cool. I think I'd like to do that, and that's our future.
Well, thank you. I think we're kind of winding down a little bit here. Gary, thanks for that. And I would just want to also say to that point, that is one of the really big topics and issues that we as a chapter have, is how do we keep this thing moving forward with some energy and excitement and the same enthusiasm that this group had up here. And that may not be possible in its configuration now, but this is where some of the things you're talking about, maybe we have to change in some way. We are all getting older, there's no question about it. And hopefully we can hopefully we can come to some conclusions on that down the road. But
just one last thing, okay? To that point,
yeah.
And I brought this up at the museum this morning, and I've been advocating it with Laconia Rotary. There's more automotive enthusiasts in this country and more automotive cars than boats. And when you go to a car show, it is mobbed, and there's a lot of them. There's an auto show at the Weirs the same weekend that we have the boat show here, typically. And I think it would make sense, if you want to talk about paradigm shifts, if you want to talk about sustainability, is to invite all of those antique automobiles or muscle car owners into our group here. Because I think you'll find if somebody owns, how many here have antique boats that have antique cars and muscle cars? Yeah, there's quite a few around here. So there's a crossover there, and I think if we can find a way, we don't have to merge, but we need to collaborate with that side of the business, and what that will do is give a bigger audience to what we have here. And who knows if that kid that is looking at his dad's hot rod and walks on the docks and sees a boat and says, I like that more than the hot rod. And I want to go there, and you wind up with 17, 18, 9-year-old kids, 19-year-old kids like we had with Mark.
So that's why we have the combined boat show and with car shows now, and I think it's a good, mix-up to have the cars and the boats. So, and I didn't ask for cars to come to our summer show, but they came, and they lined up, and we had
We should get invited to bring a couple of boats to the car shows.
Oh yeah,
To reverse that, and I think that would generate more than having the cars come in.
I brought my my little William Hand down to the extravaganza down at Bob Bear's racetrack, and I was the only boat there. Linda had me, Linda DeBeca had me bring it down to represent the boat museum, and there was a lot of people who were just interested in that. So there were, had these multi-million-dollar cars there. So that was cool.
The fall show, by the way, had a phenomenal car turnout.
We had great cars, Packards, Duesenberg, even a Lincoln Zephyr. Anyway, I just want to say thank you to this guy here, Dennis Shower, who this was his idea, and he carried the ball and he followed through, and we did a little phone-a-thon, and we got people to come that we really wanted to come, and I'm glad everyone showed up. And I want to thank Steve Balitza for doing all the administrative work, and I want to thank these three people here very much for coming and remembering all this stuff that, would slip my mind. I can't even talk about what I did 40 years ago, so these guys are talking about something that happened 50, 60 years ago. So amazing.
Maybe.
Yeah. So thank you all for coming, and we okay.
Hey, don't leave now.
Oh, big debt of gratitude to Eric.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. 25 years worth. In recognition, we've got a couple of little recognition of service to these two people, and I'll give the first one to Linda Largy. Maybe, Linda, how do we get you up here so we can take a better picture of this? Thank you so much for leading this group. And Jerry, you've got something similar. Why don't you come over on this side?
This would be good. On it.
All right, here we're going to take a picture of it. Thanks for all of you, your work, your service. Thank you very much. You get to keep that. Hang that in a prominent place.
I will. Very nice.
All right, guys, I think that about wraps it up. And again, thanks so much for coming. I know this means a lot to them. It means a lot to those of us that want a little reboot on history, and many of us don't even know the beginning. So this is good. And I hope that everybody will continue and will try hard to become active and more active in the group. Thank you.